She was once a brilliant doctor. Now, she is a sought-after unlicensed surgeon in the black market. She handles complex brain disorders that even hospitals cannot cure. She can find a slim chance of survival through surgery. One night, a crime boss with a brainstem glioma was brought from the hospital. Due to a lack of staff, a nurse was also brought along. This makeshift team operated in a tent. They assisted the unlicensed genius in a complex surgery. Meanwhile, Professor Choi was conducting a brain surgery in a formal hospital. He is very strict. Any distracted student is immediately expelled from the OR. At the same time, the genius doctor had her assistant wake the crime boss during surgery, a rare act. She located the tumor by speaking with the patient and touching nerves. Professor Choi completed his surgery smoothly. Back in his office, he heard police asking students about an agent arranging illegal surgeries. They hoped Choi could help identify the situation from the video evidence, which unfortunately had no clear end and did not show the surgeon. A student noted that the video alone couldn't specify the surgery type, but it seemed to occur deep in the brain, suggesting high complexity. Such surgeries are only known to be successfully performed by Choi nationally. The patient might have died. Choi watched silently, only requesting the video be sent to him, then dismissed the officers. Curiously, a student noticed the surgeon's hands in the video seemed feminine, suspecting it might be Young Se-ok. Hearing this, Choi's expression turned complex, and he instructed the student to leave. He then called a friend, hoping to quickly locate Boss Min. The next morning, after a busy night, Young Se-ok woke up on the sofa. The crime boss's surgery was very successful. He just had a weak pulse. The kidnapped nurse received a payment of 5 million Korean won, but felt it was too little. She approached Young Se-ok, reminding her that they both had worked at Yonshin Hospital, and mentioned rumors about her and Professor Choi. This meeting made Young Se-ok feel uneasy. In the afternoon, she told her assistant to be more cautious in choosing partners, as the nurse might expose their illegal practice. The assistant reassured her, noting the nurse had her own shady past. Unexpectedly, the nurse decided to take a big risk. While changing the boss's dressing unguarded, she secretly injected a large amount of sedative into the saline solution. She then rifled through Young Se-ok's bag and followed her to the boss's room to openly negotiate terms. The nurse bluntly stated she only received 5 million won and felt unfair, considering Young Se-ok, an unlicensed doctor, earned more. Young Se-ok, tired of the small talk, asked how much she wanted. The nurse demanded a monthly hush money of 2 million won and refused to participate in illegal practices. Hearing this, Young Se-ok couldn't help but smile and agreed immediately. In the afternoon, a friend brought Professor Choi to Boss Min. However, after viewing the video, Boss Min stated that he did not arrange the surgery and usually dealt with internal organs, never the brain. As Professor Choi's condition worsened, he decided to personally inquire if the surgery in the video was successful. At dusk, the assistant instructed the gang members to remove the equipment and destroy the used surgical materials to avoid leaving evidence for the police. They then returned the crime boss to the hospital. That evening, feeling thirsty, the nurse habitually opened Young Se-ok's bag and drank a large gulp of water from it. When she woke up again, the building was empty, and her own bag was missing. After searching, she found it with the money still inside. While counting the money happily, she didn't notice the impending danger. Suddenly, an IV tube tightly strangled her neck until she ran out of air, and Young Se-ok did not let go. The nurse never expected to be extorted by a madwoman. By the time the assistant arrived, Young Se-ok had resolved all troubles and even threw the nurse's money into a donation box. The next morning, Young Se-ok and her assistant returned home. At that moment, Professor Choi called, saying he would visit soon. Young Se-ok's memory flashed back to being expelled from the hospital by Choi for some reason. She got so angry that she chased after him with an IV tube in hand, which helped her regain her composure after slapping him. However, Choi warned her never to enter an operating room again, and left after dropping a harsh word. After work, Young Se-ok knelt at the door, hoping for another chance. But when Professor Choi came by, he just glared at her angrily without a word, and walked past. From that day, Young Se-ok became an unlicensed genius doctor. Meanwhile, Choi arrived at his home and revealed he was diagnosed with a brainstem glioma in a tricky location. He needed surgery by someone who wouldn't damage his hands, and he could only take a maximum of 2 months off, including recovery. Regardless of Young Seok's attitude, he unilaterally announced he would inform her once he found the right place for the surgery. Professor Choi fell ill just after leaving Young Seok's house. He tried to inject himself with fentanyl, but the vial fell to the ground. In a burst of rage, thinking of the professor's treatment of her, Young Seok stomped on the vial. Young Seok entered medical school at 17, with perfect scores, advancing early due to her intelligence. Her tutors found her very smart, and she worked hard as an intern. However, all the professors who taught her considered her a madwoman and a ticking time bomb, warning others to be cautious around her. On Professor Choi's first day back in the country, Young Seok found his office and showed him a weekly neurosurgical quiz, pointing out 2 3mm tumors on the nerve axis and diagnosing the patient with chordoma, expecting his praise. While Choi reluctantly reviewed her analysis, Young Seok became restless, flipping the desk lamp and eating a hamburger meant for Choi, muttering not to trust other professors, especially Professor Choi's favored student, Professor Liu, whose papers she claimed were mere compilations of others' work. Determined to become Choi's apprentice, Young Seok eagerly awaited his feedback on the quiz. She nearly laughed aloud with joy at his written comment. Perfect. Whether from insomnia or excitement, she stared at the word until it almost seemed bewitched. That night, she waited for him in the rain after her shift, pleading for him to teach her every piece of knowledge and surgical skill, promising to dedicate her life to medicine. Touched by her persistence, Choi agreed to take her as his apprentice, only to later realize she was not only mad, but also lacked self-control. In just 6 months, an opportunity to study in Boston arose at the hospital. Everyone expected Young Seok to get the only spot, and she thought so too. However, surprisingly, the spot was given to a less impressive colleague. Unable to understand, she stormed into Professor Choi's office, not caring about the presence of others, and demanded to know why he chose that idiot for the opportunity. Unfortunately, the idiot's mother was sitting there. Realizing her identity, Young Seok's anger shifted. She suspected the mother had bribed the professor, stealing her educational opportunity. Her outburst grew as she insulted the actions of the apparently cultured woman and even confronted Professor Choi directly. The colleague's mother left the office amid the drama. After the office incident, Young Seok was completely excluded from all surgeries by the hospital until the day Professor Choi was away at a conference. Another professor allowed her to perform emergency surgery. However, when Choi returned and learned of this, he immediately entered the OR and demanded she stop. Young Seok argued her competence, questioning why she should be expelled. Choi dismissed her explanations and had her removed. This incident fueled their mutual resentment. The next day, Director Huang contacted Young Seok for an illegal surgery. She prepared, but the patient never showed. As she was packing up, she noticed Choi's car nearby and realized he had interfered. Young Seok couldn't understand why he always obstructed her. Choi clarified that he had secured a spot for her in Boston, where she could perform the complex surgeries she dreamed of, but only if she first removed a tumor from his brain. Young Seok was unwilling and threatened to sabotage the surgery. However, Choi, knowing her well, countered that a proud genius like her would never tarnish her reputation. He closed his car window, leaving no room for her to argue. After her medical license was revoked, Young Seok became a pharmacist. Across from her workplace, a recently released harasser, emboldened by his electronic ankle bracelet and others' fear, either brutally assaulted his sister during the day or followed and spied on Young Seok at night. Already in a bad mood, Young Seok was pushed too far by his actions. The next day, she intentionally left her umbrella at the store. When the harasser brought it to her, she arranged to celebrate the removal of his ankle bracelet the following day. She then specially prepared a drink that would induce sleep. The next afternoon, she brought the harasser back to her home. Before the drug took effect, she had him bring back a large roll of plastic sheeting. Soon, he was drowsily asleep. When he awoke, he was tightly bound like a rice dumpling, lying on the plastic sheeting he had retrieved. As soon as he regained consciousness, Young Seok acted, slicing open his major artery. The blood splattered on her face made her genuinely smile. The scene shifts. Young Seok dragged the body to an unknown location, then calmly put on her headphones and played her favorite song. She began digging a large pit, swiftly completing a grave 1 meter deep and 2 meters square. However, just as she was dragging the harasser into it, someone approached from a distance. She immediately hid beside her car, ready to silence any witnesses. Not long ago, Kim Myung-jin returned to his home country with his son to find Professor Choi. They revealed that they were classmates from the same graduating class. Kim Myung-jin had developed a meningioma and sought surgery from Professor Choi. However, Jung Se-ok, obsessed with medicine, wondered why the usually stern Professor Choi couldn't stop smiling whenever he saw Kim Myung-jin. She pondered this during a lunch break and concluded it must be as she suspected. After work, she learned from the head nurse that Professor Choi was extremely busy and nervous because a friend was hospitalized. After all, performing surgery on someone he knew left no room for errors, and Choi had never made a mistake before. Jung Se-ok kept these words in mind. The next day, she secretly replaced the surgical assistant and intentionally handed Professor Choi a scalpel in such a way that it cut his palm, making it impossible for him to continue the surgery. While everyone might think her goal was to perform more surgeries to refine her skills, it wasn't that simple. Hours later, Jung Se-ok reported that the surgery went smoothly. However, Professor Choi only wanted to know why she did what she did. Jung Se-ok speculated that Choi did not choose her as his assistant because he wanted an error to occur during the surgery. She believed Choi must really dislike Kim Myung-jin and used laughter to cover his nervousness, probably unable to stand him internally. However, after expressing her thoughts, she did not receive the approval she expected from her mentor, which she found utterly incomprehensible. Years later, when Professor Choi stumbled upon his former protege disposing of a body, Jung Se-ok seemed indifferent, even continuing to drag the body as if he were not there. Professor Choi was particularly worried, wondering if she feared spending the rest of her life in prison if discovered. Upon hearing this, Jung Se-ok became even more enraged, shouting that her life had already been ruined by Professor Choi and that if she were caught, she would choose suicide over prison. Professor Choi wanted Jung Se-ok to further her studies in Boston and start over, but she knew it was conditional on her removing a tumor from his brain. She refused and continued to dig her hole, feeling victorious. This infuriated Choi, who finally vented his long-held frustrations. He had once helped her, knowing she was just a poor student living on scholarships without money or a family, always carrying an old backpack and causing trouble, yet always wanting to prove she was the smartest. The next day, Jung Se-ok was thrilled to hear that the police were searching for the harasser. However, her excitement was short-lived, as a clerk informed her that someone had reported them to the Pharmaceutical Regulatory Authority for prescription substitution issues, resulting in a 30-day business suspension. During this time, Professor Choi called, admitting he was behind the incident, and suggested they meet in Busan if she wanted to talk seriously. Busan was hosting the most prestigious medical awards ceremony, and everyone expected Choi to win. Jung Se-ok was determined to embarrass him. By chance, while in the restroom, she overheard that the award ceremony's main sponsor was the Japanese Ichida family. The chairman of the Ichida group had funded the event heavily for his dying son. The designated winner, Professor Choi, was the surgeon for his son. Returning to her hotel, Jung Se-ok immediately researched the chairman's information and approached him, claiming they had met once in Tokyo through Professor Choi. She then played a surgical video on TV. It showed the patient's name and age, diagnosed in June with a brainstem glioma. The video revealed the tumor was 4 centimeters and in a complex location, which led 9 top hospitals in Korea to refuse the case. This video was the only evidence of how Jung Se-ok saved the patient. She questioned why so many hospitals would decline a typical brainstem glioma case. The truth was that the child, like the chairman's son, had hemophilia. To remove a tumor deep in the brainstem, a large incision was needed for a clear view, but hemophiliac's blood does not clot, which is why the hospitals were unwilling to risk their reputations. Jung Se-ok was very confident in her skills and her successful cases. While the chairman reviewed the information, she idly flipped through other materials. 5 hours and 23 minutes passed, yet the chairman remained worried. Young Seok proposed to perform the surgery on his child, promising to complete it in 4 hours under one condition, that Professor Choi must suffer tremendously. However, her argument did not convince the chairman, who had painstakingly chosen Professor Choi as the recognized doctor for the job. That night, the chairman unexpectedly approached Jung Seok and agreed to give her 4 hours to perform the surgery. The highly complex surgery then began. Initially, Jung Seok proceeded methodically, but suddenly, the child began to bleed profusely, and his vital signs plummeted rapidly. The Japanese doctors panicked and urged her to stitch up the incision. However, Jung Seok, undisturbed by external factors, continued her work, driven by a fierce desire to outperform Professor Choi. Shortly after, the chairman burst into the operating room and was shocked to see the floor covered in blood, with young Seok drenched as if possessed by a demon. The scene shifted again to the award ceremony where the host announced the winner, Dr. William from Sage University. The result caused an uproar, as the highly favored Professor Choi did not win. Young Seok was thrilled to have beaten her mentor. As she was about to leave, she was stopped by Kim Myong-jin's son, Kim Gi-young. During their conversation, she learned that Kim Myong-jin had recovered very well from his surgery. However, a month later, he called Kim Gi-young, saying he needed to go out alone and urged his son to focus on his studies. After that, he vanished. The police concluded that Kim Myong-jin had left home voluntarily and did not open a case, but Jung Seok suspected it was not as simple as that. At the same time, Professor Choi, who did not win the award, was not as disappointed as one might expect. Instead, he was happily drinking with colleagues. It turned out that the chairman had approached him before the surgery and disclosed all of Jung Seok's plans. Surprisingly, Professor Choi not only willingly gave up the award, but also vouched for his former disciple, believing she deserved a chance. This explained why the chairman's attitude changed so quickly that day. However, Professor Choi never mentioned this to Jung Seok. Meanwhile, Jung Seok was convinced that Professor Choi had killed Kim Myong-jin. At the same time, the police discovered a strangled nurse buried behind an abandoned building. Professor Choi, serving as a consultant, immediately recognized it as Jung Seok's work. At the crime scene, Jung Seok watched the police collecting evidence with interest. Suddenly, spotting Professor Choi, she grew worried he might report her. She put on a police raincoat and confronted her former mentor. Here's a detail. Jung Seok told the officers she owned many Rottweilers. Professor Choi quickly led her to a secluded corner, questioning her audacity to appear there. However, Jung Seok, convinced she had ruined Professor Choi's chance at the Ichida Award and that he was cooperating with the police, adamantly stated her intention to find evidence that he killed Kim Myong-jin. That afternoon, the police found something strange on the body. Animal hair, initially identified by the National Forensic Service as such, with further details pending lab results. Meanwhile, Kim Gi-young and Jung Seok, acting on a tip, went to a sealed-off psychiatric hospital to search for his father. It's important to note that the person who provided the tip wore a glove on their right hand. According to the uncle's testimony, there was a man at the hospital named Lee Suk-gui who resembled Kim Myong-jin. He distinctly remembered a scar on the back of Lee's head, shaped like a question mark. Unlike Kim Gi-young, who was distressed, Jung Seok was only interested in whether anyone had visited the patient. Upon hearing this, the uncle suddenly recalled a gray-haired man pushing a wheelchair around the hospital. Jung Seok, intrigued, immediately showed the uncle her phone to see if he recognized Professor Choi. Meanwhile, a friend found out through connections that the animal hair the police discovered was from a Rottweiler, implicating Jung Seok was soon to be suspected. That night, aside from his verbal account, the uncle had no evidence to prove his claims. He planned to come back the next day with photos from Kim Myong-jin's hospital stay. However, an impatient Kim Gi-young suspected the man was after a reward and confronted him. Jung Seok quickly intervened, calming Kim Gi-young and sending him away before preparing to treat the uncle's wound. Upon cutting open his glove, she was shocked to find Kim Myong-jin's gold ring on the uncle's finger, instantly verifying his story. Just then, Kim Gi-young burst into the room. The uncle, feeling guilty, ran away, but Kim Gi-young caught him, and they both fell off a cliff during the struggle. Watching them fall, Jung Seok was unsure what to do. Reporting to the police could endanger her, but doing nothing would prevent exposing Professor Choi. Eventually, she decided to take both men to the hospital. Unfortunately, the uncle died from his injuries, and Kim Gi-young was left in critical condition. Meanwhile, Professor Choi intentionally sped in his car to be caught on surveillance, then parked it under a camera at his house and instructed his servant to leave early, creating a solid alibi. He then drove Kim Myung-jin's Rolls-Royce to meet a police officer who knew Jung Se-ok had Rottweilers and discreetly drugged him. As Jung Se-ok suspected, Professor Choi was the killer of Kim Myung-jin. Years ago, Professor Choi coerced Kim Myung-jin with a scalpel, forcing him to call his son and lie about wanting a free life. After the call, Choi quickly slashed Kim Myung-jin's vital spot, causing severe bleeding. Kim tried to escape, but eventually fell off a cliff. Thinking Kim was dead, Choi was unaware that a friend had discovered his secret. Earlier, Choi had asked this friend to buy property in the mountains, oddly choosing a land with many wild dogs. Curious, the friend followed Choi and witnessed the stabbing and fall of Kim Myung-jin. The friend neither called the police nor delivered a final blow, but instead administered first aid. Kim Myung-jin woke up but lost his memory due to severe brain damage and was placed in a mental hospital by the friend, where he later died in a nursing home. The friend didn't plan to expose Choi. After seeing Kim Myung-jin's ashes, Choi returned to the murder scene, threw Kim's ring into the cliff with a heavy heart, and reminded Jung Seok that police found dog hair on a murdered nurse's clothes, making Jung a suspect soon. As Choi's hands grew slower, he realized their time was limited. Despite this, Jung refused to operate on Choi and reminded him that he hadn't told anyone about their connection. The friendship between them ended, but Jung often reminisced about Choi's words at night. His partner, concerned about recent events, feared for their situation. Jung, saddened, wished to escape to prison where daily surgeries before meals and sleep sounded like heaven. The partner then mentioned Jung's assistant, Seo Young-ju, who would follow Jung into prison without hesitation. Recently upset because his mentor wouldn't tell him the truth, Jung Se-ok has been irritable, refusing to eat or sleep, and instead spends his days hunting wild boars in the woods. This behavior worries his assistant, Seo Young-ju. Once, Seo Young-ju suffered from a malignant brain tumor, but refused surgery, wishing only to end his life due to the unbearable pain. Seeing through Seo Young-ju's intentions, Jung Se-ok offered to help, suggesting it might be easier to die during surgery. Resigned to his fate, Seo Young-ju agreed, but unexpectedly, Jung Se-ok cured his disease. Grateful, Seo Young-ju became devoted to Jung Se-ok. After being reminded by a partner, Jung Se-ok realized Seo Young-ju's dedication. The next morning, he made juice for Seo Young-ju and called him to wake up, only to find him not in the room. When contacted, Seo Young-ju said he was busy at school and couldn't talk. That afternoon, Jung Se-ok went to the school but didn't find Seo Young-ju among the dispersing crowd. Calling again, Seo Young-ju claimed he was going to the movies. Feeling a bit dejected, Jung Se-ok was unaware that Seo Young-ju had been captured by a gang. Due to a nurse's death bringing attention, the police began investigating illegal surgeries and discovered a gang's involvement. The gang leader, wanted for illegal surgery, kidnapped Seo Young-ju to find out who killed the nurse. Despite threats, Seo Young-ju lied to protect Jung Se-ok. Meanwhile, unaware of these events, Jung Se-ok felt sullen and went to the cinema alone. After the movie, he waited outside, but Seo Young-ju did not show. Seo Young-ju finally called, revealing what had happened. That night, Jung Se-ok went to the gang's location, met Seo Young-ju, and the gang leader involved in the illegal surgery. After a conversation, the leader became convinced that Jung Se-ok was the nurse's killer and blackmailed her to kill a broker to prevent him from informing the police about the gang's activities. After agreeing to the gang's terms, Jung Se-ok brought Seo Young-ju back home. To Seo Young-ju's surprise, Jung Se-ok, once willing to kill, now wanted to flee to the Philippines with him. Seo Young-ju angrily urged Jung Se-ok to be more rational. During an agitated moment, several fire engines roared past, and upon returning home, Jung Se-ok found that his dog kennel had caught fire. Grieving over the beloved dogs that died in the flames, Jung Se-ok was heartbroken. After the fire was extinguished, Jung Se-ok, certain that Professor Choi was behind the arson, arranged a meeting with him. Unexpectedly, Young Seok drove into the back of Professor Choi's car with rage and repeatedly rammed it. However, Professor Choi, remaining calm, walked to the rear of his vehicle and faced Young Seok calmly. Young Seok accelerated towards him, but swerved at the last moment, sparing his mentor. It seemed Professor Choi had won the bet. Devastated by the loss of his dogs, Young Seok secluded himself in his room, crying like a heartbroken young girl. The next day, the broker responsible for arranging illegal surgeries visited, bringing information about another complex brain surgery. Furious and unwilling to cooperate, Young Seok wished he could kill the broker. Despite this, the broker persisted, reminding Young Seok of his debt which was now due. Forced by his financial obligations, Young Seok agreed to cooperate. The surgery was scheduled to take place on a cruise ship. On the night they were to board, Young Seok and Seo Yongju prepared for the challenging surgery, which would also involve another surgeon. Curious about who it might be, Young Seok saw a car approach and recognized the second surgeon stepping out. It was Professor Choi. Recently, the broker had been under police surveillance, and suspecting Young Seok's involvement in the nurse's death, he blackmailed Professor Choi the day before. If Professor Choi cooperated, the broker would stay silent about Young Seok's actions to the police. On the day they met, the broker used foul language and suspected an inappropriate relationship between Professor Choi and Young Seok. Angered, Professor Choi wanted to kill him, but restrained himself to protect Young Seok. They decided to cooperate with the broker to perform an illegal surgery for a high-profile individual. As night fell, Young Seok and her mentor, Professor Choi, prepared to board the cruise ship one after the other. The surgery was to be a collaboration between the two. However, Young Seok was filled with rage when facing her mentor. The broker explained that the patient specifically requested Professor Choi, who would lead the surgery while Young Seok assisted. That night, Young Seok stood on the deck holding a dog tag stained with ashes. She threw it into the sea in sorrow. Professor Choi approached and noticed her distress. He brought up the dog incident, admitting he was responsible for the fire, claiming it was meant to help Young Seok move on, as they were just dogs. Enraged, Young Seok repeatedly struck Professor Choi with an umbrella until Seo Yongju and another partner intervened. Upon hearing about the attack on Professor Choi, the broker became furious, threatening that if the surgery was ruined, everyone on the ship would suffer. Curious, Seo Yongju asked who the patient was, and the broker mysteriously replied, "A god." When Professor Choi met the patient, it turned out he was not a god, but the leader of a cult, misleading people and commanding a following of 200,000. Before the surgery, Young Seok pulled her partner aside to discuss Professor Choi's shaky hands. During the operation, Young Seok would handle the endoscope and instructed her partner to keep a close watch on Professor Choi to prevent any mishaps. To stabilize his hands, Professor Choi injected himself with a drug before the surgery commenced. In the operating room, the cult leader was uneasy seeing Professor Choi's young female disciple. He demanded Young Seok explain the surgical procedure. Pointing at the brain scan of the leader and with a haughty tone, Young Seok clearly explained the steps, gaining frequent nods of approval from the cult leader. Young Seok was concerned about Professor Choi and offered to switch positions if he felt uncertain. However, the always stubborn Professor Choi declined his pupil's kind offer. Once the surgery started, they worked closely and smoothly, but soon Professor Choi's hands began to tremble. Young Seok suggested switching positions again, but Professor Choi steadied himself and continued, while bluntly telling Young Seok that she was impulsive and self-centered and lacked gratitude towards him. In contrast, Professor Choi expressed his gratitude towards Young Seok, stating that operating together was the most exhilarating and proud moment of his life. Young Seok was surprised, having always thought Professor Choi disliked her. After several hours, thanks to their seamless cooperation, the surgery was a success. Later, Young Seok spoke with her mentor on the deck. Revisiting the joy of operating together after so long, Professor Choi couldn't hide his happiness. With a defiant look, Young Seok also opened up, sharing that the days she spent operating with Professor Choi at the hospital were the happiest of her life, even though those times were now past. Realizing that today might be the last time they operated together, Jung Se-ok thanked her mentor with a deep bow. The next day, as Jung Se-ok and Seo Young-ju disembarked, she was displeased to learn that Professor Choi had already left. Meanwhile, Professor Choi took a break during his drive and pulled out the letter Jung Se-ok had written years ago when applying for a residency. Colleagues had warned him that although Jung Se-ok was exceptionally talented, she had some mental issues. And this application letter was the perfect evidence. In the letter, Jung Se-ok expressed her intense desire to become a neurosurgeon, stating that neurosurgery was her only and urgent choice. From a young age, she felt as if her brain was like the cosmos, with countless explosions occurring every moment, as if there were bugs in her brain making it impossible for her to stop thinking. This constant barrage of thoughts made it painful for her to eat and sleep normally. Interestingly, the young Professor Choi and Jung Se-ok felt exactly the same way. While studying, Professor Choi also felt as if there were worms in his brain, constantly active. One day, as a doctor, Professor Choi saw a living human brain for the first time. At that moment, his eyes filled with fascination, as if admiring a superb piece of art, a winding and mysterious cosmic maze. From that moment, Professor Choi felt calm for the first time. The metaphorical worms in his brain seemed to stop crawling. His experience mirrored Jung Se-ok's, who also felt peace after seeing a human brain for the first time. The broker planned to take Jung Se-ok and Seo Young-ju out to eat in a busy area, but in reality, he had made a deal with the police to hand over Jung Se-ok, a doctor involved in illegal surgeries, to avoid his own capture. Sensing something was off, Jung Se-ok made an excuse to send Seo Young-ju away and confronted the broker, claiming she would take him to a quiet place. Just then, a former colleague from the hospital called Jung Se-ok, informing her that Professor Choi was seriously ill and had little time left. Stunned, Jung Se-ok turned around to find the broker had disappeared. She noticed bloodstains on the road and saw someone in a nearby alley taking the broker away. Surprisingly, the person who abducted the broker seemed to be her mentor, with whom she shared a special connection. While Jung Se-ok was surprised, Seo Young-ju noticed the police nearby and quickly pulled Jung Se-ok away. At that moment, Jung Se-ok received a text message. Following the address in the text, Jung Se-ok found a nearby lighthouse and discovered a guest's car keys there. They drove off in the guest's car. After getting out of the car, Jung Se-ok hurriedly contacted a former colleague at the hospital to inquire about Professor Choi's real condition. The colleague revealed that Professor Choi's MRI results were not good. After a moment of frustration, Jung Se-ok asked the colleague to send him the MRI images he saw. Later, Jung Se-ok checked his email and found the MRI images sent by his colleague, which were different from those Professor Choi had sent him earlier. Clearly, Professor Choi had deceived Jung Se-ok by hiding the severity of his illness. Seo Young-ju urged Jung Se-ok to save Professor Choi, noting that Professor Choi had even committed murder for her. Jung Se-ok was visibly agitated and extremely uneasy. The next day, his partner returned. Recalling the face of his mentor, Jung Se-ok asked his partner to find him an operating room. He was determined to operate on Professor Choi. After seeing Professor Choi's MRI images, his partner also felt the surgery would be challenging. Yet, Jung Se-ok planned to take a chance to save Professor Choi, even considering a risky cerebral vascular transplant. Seo Young-ju reminded her of the high risks of the surgery, but Jung Se-ok was resolute. That day, Kim Gi-young, who had fallen off a cliff, died. Professor Choi and Jung Se-ok attended Kim Gi-young's funeral. Jung Se-ok confronted Professor Choi about why he had killed Kim Gi-young's father. Professor Choi finally told the truth. Years ago, Kim Myung-jin had been impressed with Jung Se-ok's medical skills and wanted to poach her to a U.S. hospital to profit from her expertise. Knowing Kim Myung-jin as an unscrupulous businessman who exploited young doctors for personal gain without regard for their limits, Professor Choi was still visibly angry about the matter. He felt that anyone who dared to poach someone he had painstakingly trained deserved to die. Jung Se-ok and Professor Choi had the same reaction. She would have killed Kim Myung-jin too. Professor Choi glanced at Jung Se-ok, muttered, "Stinky girl," and walked away. As it rained outside, Professor Choi and Jung Se-ok were reminded of the past. In the pouring rain, Jung Se-ok voiced her deepest doubt. Why had her mentor distanced himself from her and abandoned her? Before Professor Choi could answer, Young Se-ok spoke up with her own conclusion. She believed it was because she had discovered his intent to murder Kim Myong-jin, which had hurt his pride. Professor Choi admitted that as a teacher, he couldn't reveal murderous intentions in front of his students. However, Young Se-ok was still unhinged, not feeling ashamed at all about murder. Instead, she felt a kindred spirit in Professor Choi, capable of murder, which excited her from within. Gradually, Young Se-ok calmed down. Although Professor Choi had led her into a mess, she didn't want him to die. Professor Choi then asked if her decision to operate was out of sympathy for him, nearing death. Young Se-ok loudly countered that she genuinely didn't want Professor Choi to die. After speaking, she sternly called Professor Choi a stinky old man, like a parent scolding a willful child, demanding he await surgery without engaging in any foolish acts like murder. In preparation for the surgery, Young Se-ok began watching related surgical videos. Additionally, her partner successfully found an operating room in a clinic. As the surgery approached, crises emerged. The police found a broker's body in an alley. An autopsy showed a ruptured spleen, a sign the assailant had medical training. Alley surveillance only captured the assailant's back. However, the officer in charge witnessed the assailant's face, identifying Professor Choi. The police were convinced that the confessing illegal surgeon was also Professor Choi. Consequently, the officer confronted Professor Choi with his suspicions. Unperturbed, Professor Choi laughed it off, knowing the officer's secrets as well. Professor Choi threatened mutual destruction if the truth was revealed. Nonetheless, the officer vowed to bring Professor Choi to justice. Soon, tech enhanced the surveillance footage quality, and the officer clearly saw Young Se-ok in the alley footage. That night, Young Se-ok was brought in for questioning. Facing interrogation, she remained extremely calm, claiming she had just gone to the alley for fresh air. The officer then presented evidence of Young Se-ok's past attempt to strangle Professor Choi in the hospital, suggesting her deep hatred for him. The officer's words made Young Se-ok think back to the past when she had asked Professor Choi to share all his knowledge with her. Professor Choi asked what he would get in return, and Young Se-ok frankly replied that her repayment would be absorbing all the knowledge. At that, Professor Choi had laughed heartily. Thinking of this, Young Se-ok smiled slightly, realizing that ordinary people could not understand the relationship between her and her mentor. However, the officer had already discovered the truth. He believed that it was Young Se-ok, not Professor Choi, who was performing illegal surgeries, and that Young Se-ok was the reason Professor Choi had killed the broker, because she was Professor Choi's weakness. This analysis startled Young Se-ok. After the questioning, she called Professor Choi to remind him of the surgery scheduled for the next day and to remember to fast. Professor Choi agreed to everything except letting Young Se-ok pick him up. Unbeknownst to Young Se-ok, Professor Choi had already cleared out his office, apparently having other plans. Additionally, through a friend, Professor Choi learned that the police had questioned Young Se-ok. That night, as Young Se-ok completed her pre-surgical preparations, Professor Choi did not show up. Meanwhile, Professor Choi contacted the officer, who arrived at Professor Choi's secret cabin and found a subordinate's body hidden in a freezer. Facing the officer, Professor Choi played a recording without hesitation. The recording was from the murdered subordinate, who had revealed that during investigations, the officer had repeatedly taken bribes and concealed the truth. This was the secret Professor Choi held over the officer. Next, Professor Choi took all the blame, claiming he was responsible for all the illegal surgeries and murders as part of a deal to keep the officer's secret hidden. Professor Choi asked the officer to give him 1 month, after which the officer could come and arrest him. Young Se-ok did not meet Professor Choi, but was visited by another doctor, Dr. Kim, who Professor Choi had specially brought from the United States. Dr. Kim informed Young Se-ok of Professor Choi's real intention, which was to die during the surgery. To this end, Professor Choi had deliberately delayed the surgery by a month and taken a certain drug. This drug had severe side effects, not only worsening his condition, but also reducing the effectiveness of anesthesia, greatly increasing the difficulty of the surgery. But this was exactly what Professor Choi intended. 1 month later, Professor Choi planned to undergo his surgery at the university hospital, intending to die on the operating table, under the scalpel of his beloved student. Upon learning of her mentor's extreme plan, Young Seok hurried to find him, but he was nowhere to be found, neither at home nor at the hospital. Professor Choi was deliberately avoiding Young Seok to prevent her from thwarting his plan. The next morning, Dr. Kim explained to Young Seok the reason behind Professor Choi's plan. Professor Choi wanted Young Seok to experience failure to teach her a lesson and help her realize the limits of being a surgeon. Young Seok felt frustrated and could not understand her mentor's thinking. Although Professor Choi believed that the surgery was bound to fail, Dr. Kim was optimistic about Young Seok's chances of success and planned to assist her during the operation. He even suggested a seemingly feasible surgical approach. However, waiting a month was too long for Young Seok, who vowed to bring the stubborn old man back for surgery right away. To find her mentor, Young Seok contacted the gang leader who had previously expressed gratitude for the surgery she performed on him. The gang leader had offered his help whenever Young Seok needed it, and now it was time for him to fulfill his promise. Later, Seo Young-ju learned that Professor Choi was staying with a partner. The gang leader contacted a police officer he collaborated with to help find the partner. The partner also could not understand Professor Choi's decision and urged him to accept life calmly, even promising to take care of him personally if his condition worsened. Despite this, Professor Choi remained stubborn. He did not want a peaceful death, but chose to die in his own way. Furthermore, Professor Choi explained to his partner the real intention behind choosing to die on the operating table. In his view, as a surgeon, Young Seok was at her peak, but overly confident. It was difficult for Young Seok to advance further, and any further development was likely to lead to decline. Professor Choi did not want this for her. He hoped Young Seok could reach greater heights, and only by losing someone she was determined to save, experiencing agonizing pain in front of a patient, could she surpass her limits and reach the next peak. At the same time, Seo Young-ju learned that Professor Choi had made a deal with the police. Under the deal, Professor Choi would take all the blame. Seo Young-ju advised Young Seok that since Professor Choi was close to death anyway, it might be easier to let him take the fall. However, Young Seok was deeply upset. She could neither let her mentor die, nor allow him to be her scapegoat. That night, the gang leader found the partner and Professor Choi. Professor Choi shared his plan with the leader, explaining that Young Seok still had a promising future, while he was already a dying man, so he would do everything to protect her. Originally there to take Professor Choi back, the gang leader was now persuaded by him. The partner couldn't understand why Professor Choi, already in a desperate situation, was still risking his life for Young Seok. Professor Choi explained that Young Seok reminded him of his own tragic youth. If the mind had DNA, he and Young Seok would definitely be family. The same evening, Young Seok contacted the officer to find out the specific terms of the deal he had made with her mentor. The officer bluntly said that in a month, Professor Choi would call him to be arrested. But by then, according to the plan, Professor Choi would have already died on the operating table. The officer would be arresting a dead man, and the case would be automatically dismissed. Young Seok loudly stated that Professor Choi would not die because she would be performing the surgery. The officer, desperate to provide an explanation to his superiors and to protect his own secrets, believed the best outcome was to capture Professor Choi at the time of his death. Ignoring these threats, Young Seok warned the officer not to target Professor Choi. Unexpectedly, the officer, enraged, drove his car at Young Seok and then dragged her out to destroy her hands, which she used for surgery. Seo Young-ju desperately protected Young Seok and was continuously beaten by the officer. In a moment of madness, Young Seok unexpectedly pulled out a knife and stabbed the officer, then seized the moment to cut his throat. After the killing, Young Seok contacted Professor Choi, screaming frantically for him to meet her alone. When Professor Choi arrived, he saw the blood-stained car and the officer's body. Young Seok, her face bloody, approached her mentor, accusing him of being a lousy teacher who only knew how to escape. Professor Choi, still concerned about Young Seok, asked if she could handle the body by herself. This time, Young Seok plainly said she needed her teacher's help. Instantly, Professor Choi smiled. Young Seok also smiled, but slowly started to cry and asked her teacher why he had treated her this way. Professor Choi candidly expressed his desire to pass on everything in his brain to his disciple. However, Young Seok waved her hand, not wanting any more knowledge from her mentor. She just wanted him to live well. In the night, Young Seok grabbed her mentor's collar, asking if he hated her so much that he couldn't bear to watch her grow. After speaking, Young Seok tried to pull him away. In the heat of the moment, Professor Choi hit Young Seok with his cane, saying if she continued to be stubborn, he would no longer undergo the surgery. Tears falling, Young Seok kept asking for a reason. Professor Choi did not answer but handed her a cell phone, promising to contact her within a month. As the night darkened, amidst Young Seok's tears and screams, Professor Choi drove away in the officer's car. A month later, as promised, Professor Choi contacted Young Seok on the night of the surgery. Before the surgery, Professor Choi extended his hand to Young Seok, who did not shake it but looked at him fiercely, determined not to fail as his top disciple. As the surgery lights were turned on, Young Seok donned her surgical gown and the surgery began. Sometime after the surgery, the chairman of a hospital's patient board sought out Young Seok to perform surgery on him. Young Seok still had a resolute look in her eyes and soon started the operation with her team. Before the surgery, someone joined the surgical team. Young Seok looked at the person with eyes wild with joy. It seemed she had successfully pulled her mentor back from the brink. The drama concludes.